try not to use dirty words in here. All right. So, no more cursing. So, we've got this idea of this structured cabling. And so in class, they got to handle cabling. Several of them have you seen it before, obviously, and some haven't. So it's one disadvantage to not being in the physical lab is that interaction. But we looked at some Cat 5 and Cat 6 cables. So we have some terms. So this is what we were looking at, and we actually looked at the Cat 6 with the spline. Again, this is the most ubiquitous cabling we have. When we terminate or end a cable, we put it into something, we call it terminating. Doesn't mean we kill it, but we call it a termination. We have some things we need to do to be prepared for that. One of them is, even though it's wire, it's got what's called a minimum bend radius. In other words, how tightly can I put that cable? I can't tie it in a bow knot. So generally, Cat 6, you want to not bend more than in a circle of about 2 inches, if you can avoid it. And you think, well, it's cable, it bends. What it actually does is starts to break some of those wires. Have you guys ever taken like an old coat hanger and you bent it back and forth until it broke? That's the same thing that happens on that wire. And in fact, because of that, we use a different type of wire for those patch cables that get unplugged and moved around more than we do that's what we call the structured cable. So the structured cable, it's a solid piece of copper for each one of those 8 lines. For the patch cables, we typically use stranded wire. So instead of one solid wire, there's 8 or 10 or 20 little tiny wires, and they handle that movement better than the solid wire. So you want to protect those cables. You don't want to lay them across the floor. A, you don't want anybody to trip, and B, it exposes them to getting cut or damaged. The same way in the ceilings or when you put them somewhere. If you have access to racking facilities and different hanging, use them. Use them. Protect it. Don't run parallel to all your power lines. So I have seen some issues where people said, man, I can't get my network connection really that great. We upgraded and I still can't get it. And we look on Wireshark, which is a tool you'll see later on. And you're seeing all these errors. And then I start looking, and what they've done is they've got a high voltage power feed through the building, and they zip tied all their network connections to it. Like, oh, wait a minute, hold on. I think I see part of your problem. Terminations, if they're not done right. And I just saw a facility the other day, and they use what's called a patch panel, and you've seen examples of it. And what you want to do with those twists is you want to minimize how far you untwist it. Because the more you untwist it, the less you lose that ability. So in this particular facility, for ease of use, they stripped back about 3 feet on each cable and untwisted it all and then put it into the patch panel. And then bundled it all together with zip ties and tape. I've never seen anybody do that before. Every day it's a new day. And so what we did in this case is we actually had to move the patch panel because they also didn't allow any slack. And I didn't want them to have to re-pull all this cabling. So it was an interesting mess. So plenum rated is fairly important. Again, anything I specify or I work on, I just generically say, you know what, I know it's a little more money up front, but I don't want to kill anybody and I don't want my name associated with it. So PVC shielded cables, or that outside conduit being PVC, when PVC burns, creates cyanide gas. Cyanide gas is not a really great thing to be inhaling. So be aware of that. I always just specify plenum grade. It's a little more expensive. If you're only buying 20 boxes of cable on a project, great, you're going to spend an extra $2,000 or $3,000. You're going to spend far more on the labor than what you do on that. We know that the IT room has some requirements. So be aware of how do I heat and cool that equipment. And some of that equipment, it's like putting a pizza oven in a small room. And some of those pieces of equipment can send a lot of heat out. And then we have the kind of the unsexy world of the IT environment. Documentation, paperwork. If you don't know where cables go, if you don't understand the topology of the network, if you don't know what this cable in the ceiling is doing, and you say, man, maybe I should just cut that, yikes, yikes. And if you don't understand what cables do and where they go and why they're there, it can make life troubleshooting a lot more difficult. So why is this network jack dead? Is it because it's not connected to a patch panel? Is it because it's not connected correctly off that patch panel to a cross connect or into a switch? Is the switch bad? Well, if I don't have that documentation, I've got to start from ground zero and try to see if I have a connection and work my way forward. And so the better documentation you have, the better off you are as an organization. Now, if I'm coming in as a contractor, I love it when you don't have any documentation, because guess what I'm going to be billing you by? I'm going to start billing you by the hour to try to document what you've got backwards. Now, I'll probably also be grumpy about it. So the other part of that documentation is when you make changes, they need to get documented. Because too often, and I'm as guilty as anybody else, we make a quick change because we need to do something really, really quickly. So we pulled cables the other day to try to get these rooms so we could mirror one room to another, and we did things as quickly as possible. Well, is that all documented how we did things? No. And where did that bite me in the butt? The other day I'm coming in on our switcher reset, and I'm like, oh, I don't remember which HDMI, because we didn't label them. We were just trying to get stuff up and running. And I am going, holy cow, how do I figure out what is what? So labeling, documentation, making that information available, and storing it off-site, a copy of it somewhere off-site, so if the building burns to the ground or something, it's probably a good thing to have. Or if you have a fire in your server room, or somebody pulls the fire alarm and floods the server room. Those things are all really important, and that documentation becomes critical. So things like network diagrams. Physically, how things are mapped out. Now we're going to look at a lot of tools in here about how to map out the logical part once we've got the physical part worked out. And so one of them we're going to work with here in class is we're going to look at something called Nmap. Well, really we're going to look at a slightly different model of it. Nmap is all non-GUI based. It's all command line. Command line is scary. Most of us like something that's got a graphic interface and we can use our mouse. So we're going to use ZenMap, and we're going to map out our networks in here. We'll probably send the IT department in a tither when we start sending out a lot of pings. I'll try to remember to alert them that we're doing that, but you never know. So when we do that, and I get an email from Gene, I'm going to blame you, right? He's like, yeah, I don't care. So we're going to look at how we map out our networks. We're going to look at some other tools for it. So for example, there's Nmap. That doesn't look really, really friendly. It's not horrible to understand it, but what it's saying is what ports are open. So that's a scan. And we haven't really defined all these items like ports and all these things yet. So we're going to get to it. There's a ton of information for you to learn in here. So this is a little more user-friendly. This is ZenMap, which is kind of the graphical interface. And so you notice it says, here I have all these IP addresses. Here's what I can scan. So we'll work with ZenMap. It's a really great tool. We're gonna give you guys a ton of tools by the time you're done. This is an example of a network diagram. So this is a fairly standard symbol set. Cisco is probably the largest networking company in the world. They've developed a lot of symbols. And in fact, we have a really great tool. So there is a tool called Visio. Visio allows us to create these and put information behind them, and I could give you a free copy of it. Except for that problem between the two different types of how does Windows install software. So I'm trying to work around that. But there's a lot of other ones. The one I tend to send students to use, because I think it's actually a little easier to use to start with, is something called SmartDraw. SmartDraw has a free trial that'll put on their trial across the screen. There's tons of different ones out there, but what we're trying to do is map this and say, all right, we know that it comes from the internet, goes to the firewall, then goes to the router. The router then connects to multiple switches. Where does that switch go to? So we can try to identify where things are going. And if we have an issue, we can try to identify what has failed or what has gone wrong. So if our switch in the middle of that goes bad, and so my web server doesn't work and my file server doesn't seem to respond, I can narrow that down by using that documentation. And so we look for those failure points. How do those things happen? So network diagrams are great. They show us how a network is logistically laid out. Wiring schematics then show how it's actually done with the wires that we're putting in there. We may have rack diagrams. In other words, on our computer racks, what's in there? How are they interconnected? So there's a lot of different drawings and different types you're going to see. So this is that idea of a wiring schematic. So this shows which computer is connected to which switch. And so then this would be a rack diagram, those 19-inch wide standard racks. So we could see what's where and why we have them connected. Because if you think about a rack, typically there's 84 spaces in a rack. The space is yay big. So depending on the equipment, you could have 75, 80 devices in a rack. It could be kind of ugly. So it's just another way that we control and monitor what's on there. So what kind of documentation do we need? We know we need to figure out where things are cabled, why they're cabled, why are they connected the way they are. We probably have some kind of inventory management. So the IT department or somewhere in the company, they have a list of all the servers, all the companies, the laptops, the desktops, the tablets, all of that. Pretty standard. We probably need to look at what's called IP addresses and how they're used. A list of all the vendors. Because in a lot of cases, we have to go to the vendor to try to troubleshoot a problem. What's the vendor? Who was the contractor who did this work? Hey, did they really give us a 10-year warranty and now suddenly things aren't working? Those kinds of pieces. What policies or standards we have in our company? So some of them should be common sense and aren't in a lot of places. If I fire you as an employee, should you have access to your company email? But yet, I run into companies all the time that not only do their fired employees and their employees who quit or died in some cases, they would still have access to everything, including access to the administrative panels, the consoles, remote access to servers. Oops. So all those kinds of things we roll up. Policies, who has access to what? Here at Peru, as a faculty member, I have access to your grades. I can look at your transcript in terms of what classes you took. I can pull off that advisor hold for you. Can I see your detailed financial aid information, including your Social Security number? No, that's a policy. They said, you know what? This is not something you need to have access to. There are other things that I think would be kind of handy that we are also denied. So I can't go pull up another class and see a class roster for any classes other than my own. So if I need to track down where Johnny is today and try to find his schedule, it's a little more difficult. But the auditors and people who are looking at that have determined that these are the very narrow set of things that you need. That's that policies. And we want to make sure that we follow those and that they're up to date. So some places have some standards and policies that are hard to understand, or maybe they didn't actually put one in. So think about it, Peru. If the admissions department could get on the Wi-Fi, but as faculty we couldn't, is that an odd set of policies? So we have to look at that and see what kind of standards they are. So these are one of the things that gets revised quite a bit. And this is where that business skills that you have, you can start to look at, well, why does the accounting department need access to financial aid information? And we can identify what things are required in there. Like anything, hardware, software, equipment, cables in the walls all have lifespans. They don't live forever, just like us. So getting rid of old equipment can be hard. figuring out an upgrade path can be challenging. And realizing that you're going to have to spend money to get rid of old hardware is one of those that a lot of companies and managers just don't understand. And sometimes you'll inherit messes when you walk in. So many years ago, I walked in and got asked to help the hospital at Fall City. And they were going to build a new facility, but to come in and see what they had to start with. And one of the guys that was working there said, well, you got to see this. And the hospital owns several houses right next door for the EMS services to sleep in, visiting doctors to sleep in and things. And he said, you got to see the basement. And this was right about the time the old tube-style monitors were going away and flat screens were becoming really available. So this was about 2008, 2009. And I walked down, and there was a basement. And that basement had a big room. It was probably at least as big as this classroom, probably 25 feet wide, 30 feet long. It's a typical smaller house, just open basement. And it is stacked floor to ceiling with CRT monitors and old computer towers. That was their solution. We put it in the house. We're just going to eventually have to do something with it. Oops. So one of the first things we had to do was figure out how do we get rid of that obsolete equipment. Luckily, there is a group, Southeast Nebraska, something. It's a group of several counties together, working together, had gotten some federal grant money to get rid of obsolete equipment and hardware. And we worked with them, and so we got a reduced rate, but it was thousands and thousands of dollars to get rid of all this stuff that nobody had really put a thought to. Great. And so we see that all the time. People have this hardware. They don't have that life cycle in their minds. So we do it here. We'll use laptops and desktops until they die. So we don't have a planned replacement of every 4 or 5 years. And it's expensive to think about that. And sometimes organizations do a good job of it. One of the things I recommend, and I know it's a weird way to do it, if you lease a car, it's kind of weird because you never really get to drive it, that you can't put any miles on it. But a computer, if you lease it for a specified period of time, it doesn't care how much it's on or it's off. And sometimes leasing hardware gets to be a really great model because at the end of a 4-year lease, you have to turn it back in. So it's got a built-in disposal schedule. You then would lease a new model. So it gets you into that cycle of, hey, every 4 years or every 5 years. Sometimes servers are every 7 years. So you get into that model of, I have to replace it. It's on a tech-style lease where it actually disappears at the end of that. It's actually not a bad way to think about it rather than I end up with all this obsolete hardware. But a lot of people are locked in. It's a lease. I don't actually own it. And they get stuck in that mindset. So think about that as an organization when you're in a company and thinking of, is this maybe a better way to approach that idea? So part of that is that cost to benefits. You want to look at how much is that inventory costing me? Are the items that are in there correct for what we need? And certainly COVID has been a stressor for that because what we traditionally have given people are desktops. Well, now we want them to work from home, and if we're providing equipment for them, which I think a company should do if you're asking me to work from home, well, now I've got to go figure out and buy laptops. And if you try to buy a laptop in the last couple of months, what has happened to the prices of laptops? They've went up because demand is high and supply is low. There's less supply because a lot of the factories that make them have been shut down. So the prices for laptops and mobile equipment have shot up. One of the craziest things that went just astronomical are things like webcams and these little microphone headsets like this. I have seen webcams. So we have a few in here we've used for a couple of things. So a fairly generic, where is it? So sitting over here somewhere. So a little bitty, not really great Logitech like this should be about $50 to $60. You go try to find them on Amazon or eBay right now, and they're $200, $250 because people needed them for work. So all of that plays into that idea of assets and management and inventory and trying to figure out. And when you have an event like COVID, or if you're down in the Gulf Coast, what's happening in the Gulf right now? Hurricanes, not one, but 2 hurricanes going to hit at once. Holy cow. You need to have proactively thought of that. Now, Could you have predicted COVID? No. If you were, there might have been some indications at the beginning of it, and your company, certainly some companies were more proactive at the beginning in saying, hey, maybe we should just go ahead and work from home, or they had better plans for that already. But sometimes it's hard to predict those things. So, labeling and naming. So, this is an area that takes a little pre-planning. So, you want to think about how your organization works on things. So, a common naming scheme for computers, some way that we understand where everyone is from its name. So sometimes we will have building room numbers attached to that name. Sometimes you'll have a running scheme where you just have a list of, this is PC 101, PC 102, PC 103. Labeling. Label makers are cheap and easy. So part of your plan is probably to label everything you can possibly find. Label wall jacks. Label jacks in your data closet. Take pictures of things. Use the same naming scheme. Be consistent. What you don't want to have is two people going out and naming stuff, and it's a weird, each one of them picks their own naming scheme. So you have to work on that and making sure that you're consistent. And that's really, there's not any better system than another. The reality is, as long as it's all documented, you can make any of these work. So, diagram, labels. I love putting labels on things. In fact, I even bought for my house, I have a label maker that's attached to the computer that I can spit out labels of about any kind of size. So I use it for like mailing labels when I mail out invoices and those kinds of things. But I also find it useful for labeling things. And as you get older, you may decide you forget or where you've rearranged things. Sometimes I label stuff at my house. My wife weirdly is OCD and really doesn't like that, but it's okay. Because I like it there because what I really think she does is rearranges things so I don't know where things are at and then tells me, no, it's always been there. No, it's not. That is not where socks went last week. I could have sworn they were in a different drawer. So anyway, labels are your friend. Label makers are cheap and easy to buy. You can have some handheld ones. What it also does is it keeps things out of your memory. We all have that idea we're going to remember everything forever until we walk out the door, and then suddenly we don't remember anything. So use a naming scheme. Come up with a convention, cable tags, labels, color codes. All good ways to deal with that. So this is an example of that. So a diagram that shows where every connection is. We also labeled it up there. And then on the far right, I know it's a little harder to see, you can see cable tags. So some labelers will even make what they call cable flags. So you can use them. You can buy ones and write on them. But there's nothing worse than finding cables that don't have any idea where they go to. So can I tell a story on computer services? Okay. Long before your time in computer services, one of our students actually is working. Are you working through an internship through them, or are you just working for them as a student worker? However you're working there. You're learning a lot, right? Probably more than you wanted to know some days. So in the data closet next door, and it's been many, many years ago, so at some point you're going to read about something called VLANs, virtual LANs. And so individual ports can be assigned a virtual network, is what they are doing. Well, it was sort of documented, but not really very well. And they had hired an IT guy who came out of telephone services. And telephone guys are really, really, really like to put everything very neat, and that data rack looks very clean and neat. And he took it on himself at one point. He said, well, there's all these different colors, and there's different links, and some of it probably was a little haphazard in there. So he pulled every network connection out, not noticing or making a note of which one went to where, and reorganized it all with really nice, neat, color-coded cables for each rack space. Well, it broke a lot of things because those VLANs are connected to that specific port. And what they found out was they didn't necessarily always have the greatest connection in terms of that documentation. And so it took them a lot of hours. Now, did he have the right intentions to make that rack very nice and neat and tidy? Yeah. But he didn't understand the ramifications behind that yet. Now, some of the things, so one of the new things that happens, the old model was the switches only would connect to a specific VLAN. Now they're tied to that MAC address, and we'll show you how that works here in the next couple of weeks. But having those naming conventions, having those documentation is critical for us to be able to be successful. So you're also going to run into some of these. And if you're in my project management, some of these are going to look familiar if you've seen them from others. You're going to see this term, a request for proposal. So the college needs another 100 cameras on campus or whatever number they decide. They would create a request for proposal and send that out to vendors to try to get contracts and pricing for it. So it's a way that we can do competitive bids. Most organizations that are very large require you to do multiple bids. That way you don't have just one vendor. Because if I just have one vendor, can that vendor be buying me breakfast, lunch, and dinner and influence those? Yeah, they certainly can. So we have to be careful. Now, there is a problem with bids. Is the lowest bid always the best bid? No. And in fact, a lot of times, a super low bid is an indication that they didn't read that RFP, and so you have to make sure that it matches the RFP. And so most bidding processes don't require you to take the lowest bid, but you have to have some justification for why you didn't. I like to call the lowest bid the least best qualified, because a lot of times it is. And if it is significantly different, if every other bid is coming at $150,000 and you have a bid for $80,000, I would be very suspicious of that and what's going on. You might have something called an MOU or Memorandum of Understanding. So companies issue those, so it's a legal binding contract. And what it says, for example, we use those a lot in the telecom sector. We had a Memorandum of Understanding that Frontier could use 2 of our fibers from Atlanta to Charlotte or somewhere else, wherever it happened to be. And so you would have a Memorandum of Understanding. So it's a legal contract. You would enter that at the beginning. So say we decided to do a camera system. That memo of understanding would say, James B. Arthur Vineyards is going to put in cameras at the college at such and such a price. It would tend to include or reference a statement of work. What exactly is being done? That statement of work says, we're going to put 100 cameras in. These are their locations. This is how we're connected. We're all going to use this version of software. So all of those are important. And then you will see other ones you're going to run into. SLAs, service level agreements. So an SLA says, I'm going to provide a service and it's at a guaranteed rate or it's at a guaranteed level of service. The most common one we see are things for service level agreements for internet service. It will say, I guarantee this speed. I guarantee that you will have an uptime of 99.997% of the time. In other words, I'll only be down like 2 hours a month at most. What they also do is specify things like call-out times. So at your house, when you buy internet, you don't sign an SLA. When Spectrum decides they want to come fix your broken internet, then they'll come and fix it. They have no contractual agreement to come out there on a Saturday or a Sunday or at midnight. But when we sign one for commercial service, a lot of times you will specify they have a 2-hour window 24/7. You also pay a significant amount more for commercial internet service and services like that. So you'll also see master service agreements. So that says not only is it this contract, but we've set up so in the future when we add more cameras, maybe if we use that example, that they would follow under that master service agreement. And a license agreement tends to be a software-based piece. So we're agreeing that you can use our software in the future. And then the icky piece. So here's project management in one day. Change management. No matter the best laid plans of mice and men, there is always going to be something that needs to change. You've decided you're going to cable this building, and suddenly this horrible IT instructor says, well, I really need 32 computer stations instead of 24. That is a change. So not only do we need to predict and pay for those, but we also need to think about the impact to our end users. So if I'm going to upgrade a router or I'm going to switch out equipment, typically I also have to not only look at that cost, but I need to look at what my impact. I sometimes pay more to do things on weekends for a business. So if I'm State Farm and during the week I know I have 1,000 employees all on the phone, on the weekends I only have 500, I might schedule work changes on that weekend, even though I know I'm going to pay a vendor more, but it's cheaper than letting 1,000 people sit there idle and also ticking off my customers. So hardware and software changes, typically we'll have in a very large scale, we'll have a group that will test software changes before they get implemented. Now, Microsoft has made our lives very miserable over the years because they tend to push out updates without even asking. And in fact, on some of the latest versions of Windows 10 and some of the updates, you can delay them for 7 days. Ooh, that's not very long. And sometimes those updates break things. There was an update about a month ago that broke some of the printer drivers. It happened to break at some of the places that I deal with right before payroll. They couldn't print payroll checks. So there are some changes. We need to know about them. Some companies make it very difficult to do. There is a lot of enterprise level software. So large scale payroll, document systems for things like power generation or large companies with their enterprise resource software. Those changes can be very dramatic if suddenly they don't work. And so we need to document and figure out a plan for what happens if it doesn't work. So we look at a lot of different ones of ways of doing it. So a patch is a small change. An upgrade is a major change to that software. So if you go from Windows 10, the spring edition, to the fall edition, that's a major upgrade. If it's simply a security patch, which can still break things, then that's probably one they roll out on their monthly updates. A rollback plan is how we revert or back level or go back to what we were. So if we do an upgrade and all of a sudden all of our software quits working, we can't run our factory anymore, we would back roll or roll back our information back to the day before. And so we typically have some tools that we can do that on a large scale. So hardware changes, cameras, workstations, printers, all that kind of thing. It all needs to be documented so we know where things are going on. This reversing or going backwards is a great troubleshooting technique. And changes really need to have a process that they go through. And Peru State College is kind of in that middle ground. We're not big enough to have all the people involved to be able to do that. And so some of our changes get documented better than others, but we don't really have a big enough staff down there to do everything that we should probably properly do, if I can speak that way. My guess is they could add another 10 people in the IT department and still have far more work to do than is time feasible. So if we can do this, we will. It's hard to do, and in most companies fall down on this quite a bit. Especially a company that is just contracting out IT services. They're really there as a Band-Aid because they don't have somebody in-house and they can't afford to hire them at a really, really great rate. If you roll out somebody like Five9 or OneNeck, it's anywhere between $200 to $250 per hour to bring them down onto site per individual. And that time starts when they leave Omaha or Lincoln or wherever they're based out of. So we're kind of in these rural areas, we're kind of in a little bit of an issue with that. It's expensive. IT is expensive. It's also got some good career locations. So change document locations. We need to make sure that it's documented as best we can. Typically we follow a single cabling standard. There are other ones out there. So you'll see in our book they mention TIA 568 standards. That's what we typically follow. But there are other organizations that have some standards. So we have to be aware of what those are. And if you inherit a building, you may not have those done right. It may have been done by somebody who didn't follow any standards, and you run into some truly, truly weird things. One of the things I've ran into fairly often is that cabling that I handed you to look at has 4 pairs. In all reality, up to 100 meg communications, it only needs 2 of those pairs. So there were 4 pairs sitting idle. Well, companies decided to save money sometimes, so what they would do was they would use those 2 pairs for data, and they would try to put a second network connection on the other 2 pairs, or run phone lines on the other 2 pairs. And then we do an upgrade. So they upgrade from 10100 switches to gigabyte switches, and there are a lot of companies still running on those 10100 switches, and suddenly everything comes to a grinding halt. It fails because those pinouts aren't right. And there's data needs, and we have to start looking at how do we pull new cable. You have to be aware of the HVAC inside of those, and one of the issues is the HVAC systems are typically far more complex. So they will have heaters on the exterior units. They will also typically have some kind of humidity control. If you've walked across the room and shocked yourself, that's not good. It's not good for the data closets. So a lot of times they'll have humidifiers built right into that system. Making sure those are serviced and updated and properly maintained is very critical. Opening the window and let the snow pile in is not a really great way to do that. In fact, if you have a window in your server closet looking onto the outside, I'm going to tell you that's probably a security issue already, unless you're inside a CIA compound. All right. That's really chapter 2 in a nutshell. So I want to look at Blackboard, and let's take a look at some of these items in here and make sure we're kind of all on the same page about what we need to do. And I know I've seen some of you working very, very hard. So I'm going to drag it over here onto the screen. So if you notice, I'm going to go back all the way out here. Week 1 and 2 ends on August 30th, and we actually do a final wrap-up then of chapter 2 next week. So we're going to revisit a few of these items, and actually the quiz for chapter 1, if I remember right, let me double check. Nope, the quiz for that is in this week. Okay. I made a lot of changes trying to get this into the 14 weeks, so pardon me if there's some dust around in my brain. All right, so there should be a week 1 quiz in here somewhere. Maybe I don't have one in there. What a shame that would be. Let me see. Is there one? Oh, there it is. Unit 1 quiz. Okay. Wanted to make sure it was in there. All right. So let's look through here and see if we make sure we're all on the same thing. So this MindTap reader is really just about how to use MindTap. Most of you are already way past that. This one also shows you what's in MindTap. The preview is just the learning objectives. What do I expect you to learn in this chapter? This is an overview of the live machine labs. Those are the more complex of the simulations you're going to use because you're actually controlling a virtual machine housed at Cengage. So this again is how to use MindTap. This talks about some of the projects and how you're going to do some of the hands-on ones. The biggest piece is at some points in this course you will need a computer that you can make what's called administrative changes on. Chapter 1 or Unit 1, just to make life miserable, they tend to call things by 2 different names. So Unit 1, Introduction to Networking. These reviews are helpful because that's where those PowerPoints that I've stolen and borrowed pieces and parts from are actually housed. And so you'll see a ton of, as it slowly goes there. So it's got a lot of the same pieces, and you can actually click on the outline and see peer-to-peer, and you can study some of those in a little better detail. So that's what those, oh, I lost it there, what those are. This is practice terms, and then this is how to start that live virtual machines. Anything that says visualize is clearly a video based on there, and most of these are only a couple of minutes. They're not horrible. The practice with the crossword. I have had more trouble. Let me see if it'll actually pull today, because I'm going to guess it won't. I'll be amazed if it does. Oh, it actually did on this one. What I have discovered is this seems to, and I'm surprised it actually pulled up, because on Chrome normally it doesn't. So depending on the version of Chrome, it may not pop up correctly. These are all based on that vocabulary. These do not put any points in gradebook for you, but it's a great way to learn some of that terminology. And we throw a lot of terms out in here. So if those don't load, and especially those people on Macs, I don't think I've had anybody with success on a Mac yet. It will certainly not load in Safari, and Chrome it seems to hiccup for whatever reason. Now, if you've got the latest version of Chrome, it may suddenly magically start working also. All right. So, Lab Simulation 1 and 2. So these are in, and this is also where it gets a little ugly. We call them lab simulations. Inside here, when you start it, as it slowly goes, it's called Lab Connection, just to make it a little more confusing. So these are, I don't want to say the easier of them, but they are the more soft touch. In other words, they show you, and I don't know if it'll finish loading on here because I've got so much stuff running, but these will give you videos, show you how to do the steps, and do it in great, great detail. And you can do these an unlimited number of times. So I can complete these lab simulations. If I don't like my grade, I can go back and do them as many times as I want to. I want you guys to all get 100% when you get out of here. So, Lab 1 and Lab 2. So one of them talks about creating a virtual machine. The other one is talking about connecting to a remote user, and we're going to expand on that in our class. The other one that is a little more complicated is the lab itself, the Lab 1-1. So I want to launch it and show you what it looks like. So this one you have to follow the instructions very, very carefully. And it takes a little bit of time to load. And I have no patience always. So in this one, a high-resolution screen is a very good advantage. If you have a small, tiny laptop, this is going to be a little frustrating. So I'm going to click Start again because I'm right there. Yes. At some point I was in here and I started it. These are all computers setting at Cengage that you can turn on. So in the instructions it will say, oh, I need to turn on this one, and I need to turn on this one. And that is an actual computer starting up. So in this case, we're reaching their farm that was in the United Kingdom, it appeared to be. So it tells you how to do things. It's got a couple videos. But you have to watch very carefully the assignments and what they're telling you to do. So they're over here on the left, and they're a little harder to read. The trickiest part for me is if I scroll up, notice there's multiple computer screens. That is sometimes a little confusing trying to click in on one of these. So here I'm adding roles on a server. That one happens to be a Windows server. So follow the directions. You may not need all of these computers, so follow the directions about which one. But those are live computers you are experimenting with. When you log out, it restores them, essentially resets them. So these are, and sometimes the screen refresh. If I have all of those open, sometimes that screen refresh here is a little tough to see. So that is the lab itself. That one is probably going to take you half an hour or more. I think you were working on it, weren't you, Mason? So it's a little tougher. And the first one is tough because you don't know what to expect and what to see. Once you get used to that interface, it goes a little quicker. They're more realistic because you're working on an actual computer at that point. So then there's our quiz. So there's some additional pieces, the lab live machine user guide. So I put a lot of stuff in there for you to use. And then I break it to say, hey, we're starting chapter 2 right here. So chapter 2 then, that preview, those administration pieces, the lab sim again. So here's another lab sim. There's only one in this particular unit. That's installing ZenMap, and you're going to scan a network in a controlled environment. We're going to take those same techniques and try it out here in the lab and see what we can see. Again, a crossword puzzle. My PowerPoints that you can also look at, they're the same as what you find in the book. Our attendance pieces, and then I put in the videos as often as I can in the attendance pieces. All right, any questions right offhand? There's a lot to do, and I know it's confusing. If you have questions, ask me. Send me screenshots. Those live labs, you need to find a block of time, probably half an hour, 45 minutes, to sit down and just be able to do them and think about it. If you have to jump up and down, the one problem with those is those servers will time off and you'll have to relog in and restart in some cases. All right, any questions? The 2 labs are graded, yes. The trying to think what else is in there that's graded. So the lab simulations are graded, the quizzes are graded, and the discussion board items are graded, and that's it. So the other ones are all for your use. If you don't necessarily need it, you don't need to go in and do the crossword puzzle. There's no points in it. But if it helps you get that terminology, and that's the biggest issue with this class, is that idea of terminology. All right, does that answer? If you have questions, email me, give me a shout, and I will try to help you out any way we can. We can use Collaborate, and I can look and see what you're doing also, so we have some tools available. All right, if there are no questions, I will stop this. But I know it seems like